60 years ago, at the height of his artistic powers and near the end of his career, Yasujiro Ozu directed 1959's Floating Weeds, a remake in sound and color of a film that was in itself an apotheosis of an earlier era, 1934's black-and-white silent feature A Story of Floating Weeds, one of the last films Ozu made before his belated conversion to sound. Floating Weeds is very nearly a direct one-to-one remake, with only a change in scenery and alterations to character ages offering significant deviations from its silent, black-and-white predecessor. And this, formidable quality of the films aside, offers a significant gift to the field of film studies, for it provides us with a robust natural experiment in how the addition of sound and color into an existing aesthetic framework affects the creation and experience of cinema. Film studies is not a science, of course, but the conditions here are practically laboratory-ready, telling the same story twice with the uniquely consistent aesthetic of one of cinema's most appreciated and prolific auteurs serving as our control, and these two major leaps in technology, sound and color, playing the role of variables. Ozu's scholarship is not in short supply, but the extraordinary opportunity these two films provide to study the topics of sound and color has not been fully exploited, something I aim to rectify here in regards to sound. Ozu's sound design is clearly very simple, patterned almost entirely in tandem with that which is visible. Contrasted with his highly complex, obsessively arranged visual design, where compositions in depth can easily run 5, 6, 7 planes deep, Ozu's soundtracks are modest, comprising no more than 3 easily discernible layers at any given time. Dialogue comes first, always loud, clear, and foregrounded. Sound effects and atmospherics, a chirping cicada, the pattern of rain, fluttering birds, or even silence itself, comes second, placed underneath the dialogue but still clearly audible. Music comes third, with non-diegetic score used sparingly, and diegetic music, usually people performing, practicing, or listening to music in another room or adjacent building, often taking the place of the atmospherics track. Finding all 3 of these layers together in a single sequence is rare, reserved mainly for transitionary bridges. In most cases, 2 layers is plenty. This simplicity, and the fact that most of these sounds are what film scholarship might traditionally deem redundant, a restatement of a sonic element understood or inferred from the film's visual language, has led even Ozu's most devoted scholars to treat sound as a footnote in the director's artistic practice, rather than a major topic worthy of discussion in and of itself. The most influential monographs on the director, by Donald Ritchie and David Bordwell, devote very little space to the topic, and most mentions of it are in passing. This hesitancy to engage with Ozu's sound is worth attending to, as it parallels a similar hesitancy to fully engage with sound as a dynamic element in film studies. The original Floating Weeds is one of Ozu's final silent films, and a very formally developed, mature one. As Bordwell notes, Ozu's final years of silent cinema see a marked rise in the percentage of shots devoted to title cards, up from an average of 12% in his earlier films to an average of 27% in his later works, just over a quarter of all shots. This increase cannot necessarily be attributed to increasingly complex plots. If anything, Ozu is paring down his storytelling at this time, previewing his best-known post-war work by focusing less on plot mechanics and more on character psychology and interpersonal relationships. The story of Floating Weeds could quite easily be told with fewer intertitles. The interiority of its characters and richness of emotive detail, however, would be lost without the prevalence of written language. Thus, significant portions of the silent film are devoted to the presentation of dialogue, and to properly understand the latter edition of sound, we should examine Ozu's editorial patterns. A traditional presentation of dialogue in silent cinema is easily understood. If there are 2 speakers, the first begins moving their lips, is interrupted by an intertitle, finishes speaking after a return from the intertitle, and in the subsequent cut, the second speaker reacts, opening their mouth and starting the process over again. A simple letter-based diagram such as speaker A, intertitle A, back to A, B, intertitle B, back to B, A, can show this process in action. Eliding a second visual utterance of the speaker in favor of jumping straight to the listener after the intertitle, so we go A, intertitle, B, intertitle A, may also be common, especially in longer sequences where the pattern is already established. Setups like these can certainly be found in Ozu's work, A Story of Floating Weeds included, and the basic pattern forms the underlying foundation of his editorial style, but Ozu is nothing if not a master of patterns. And playing with these forms to create surprise, impact, or variation is also key to how he builds sequences. For a case study, let's take a look at the confrontation between troop leader Kihachi and the scheming Otaka in the rain after Otaka learns of Kihachi's secret family. This sequence occurs 36 minutes into the film, so basic editorial patterns are already well established, and Ozu has leeway to begin reshaping these patterns for dramatic effect. If we were to diagram this scene with the simple A-B letter scheme introduced earlier, it would be far too overwhelming to be of much use, as you can see here. But watching the scene itself, it is remarkable how little clarity is sacrificed. Ozu's structure creates a visual and rhythmic dynamism between these two people that befits the fraught nature of their relationship. Most importantly, the editing illustrates a significant power dynamic belied by the cinematography. Visually, Kihachi appears taller and more powerful. The medium close-ups of both characters are taken from a very slight low angle, but Kihachi, his shoulders broader and his posture straighter, fills more of the space and seems to loom larger and with more force. However, verbally and by virtue of how many cuts in the sequence are motivated by Otaka's voice, the edit implies Otaka is the one driving the conversation and motivating Kihachi's reactions. She seems relatively unfazed by what he has to say, and his words motivate a cut to her, less often than her words motivate a cut to him, as you can see in the diagram. The cinematography aligns itself with the edit near the end in shot 23, where Kihachi's established medium close-up is pulled back, leaving him occupying less of the frame, effectively making him look smaller by the end than he was at the beginning, and signifying to us that when he tells Otaka his son belongs to a better world than her, he is speaking just as much about himself. Now, let us repeat the exercise with the sound remake, taking note once again of the editorial pattern, but also, and significantly for this version, the layers of sound and how they operate. Two key observations rise to the surface immediately. The edit is dramatically simpler here than in the silent film, while the amount of dialogue is dramatically higher and comes at a much faster clip. There are only 3 camera setups, and the editorial pattern is very simple. One person speaks, usually in close-up, and when they finish, Ozu cuts to the other, who responds. Occasionally, they will speak during the 2-shot, but never over one another. If we were to diagram this sequence using that same A-B schema used for the silent version, it would be quite clear. So clear, in fact, as to be of minimal use, just as the complexity of the silent film's form could not be captured by such a schema. Paradoxically, despite the sound version having fewer setups and cuts than the silent film, its pace feels significantly accelerated. The density of dialogue is higher, and although the words convey the same information, the basic shot-reverse shot formulation puts the characters and their words at a more direct and consistent opposition, creating the sensation of a verbal sparring match. Changes in power dynamics come much more rapidly, and are far more unsettled than in the silent film. Rather than convey these dynamics via the edit, Ozu illustrates them through blocking, with each character pacing on a horizontal axis under their respective canopy during the 2-shot when their accusations are at their most heated pitch. The elephant in the room that is this comparison is that dialogue in the 1959 film is spoken, and thus the need for intertitles eliminated entirely. On one level, it's easy to draw a stylistic through line from the 1934 film to its 1959 counterpart. In each, Ozu's camera work is similar, and his priorities lie in centering human faces during conversation, making reactions and visible emotions key to the progression of the conversation. But the shift from written to spoken dialogue makes that through line far more transformative than a simple shift in how dialogue is presented. As Rick Altman explains, there's a faulty logic at play when we undervalue the significance of synchronous sound in the presentation of dialogue. He writes, "Sound editing is first and foremost word editing. Its primary purpose is to assure the clarity of the film's dialogue. This emphasis on dialogue derives quite obviously from the role played by dialogue in the constitution of the narrative line. Without the dialogue, the images are ambiguous, incomplete, underdetermined, but such a formulation is misleading, because it implies that the same images would be used with and without dialogue. This is, however, far from being the case. Perhaps the single most important difference between silent and sound narrative films lies in the latter's increased proportion of scenes devoted to people talking, devoted, that is, to moving lips. Indeed, the major differences observed between these two scenes all come down to that final point. One version devotes a significant amount of time to the presentation of moving lips, while the other, thanks to the presence of intertitles interrupting every lip movement, must employ greater editorial complexity in connecting its dialogue to the human presence. It is hardly a radical observation to note that Ozu's style pares down over time, but it is uncommon to see sound pointed out as one of the foremost contributors to that evolution. Yet its influence is obvious when putting these two scenes side by side, wherein sound has allowed Ozu to, on the one hand, simplify his technique while also creating new narrative opportunities that build on one another in the aggregate. For instance, the silent version holds back the reveal that Kihachi and Otaka are standing under opposing canopies in the rain until the 14th shot in the sequence. The sound film establishes this immediately, as the sound effects of rain falling hard in the background would make such a reveal impossible. Since it is a heavy summer rain, and since the characters are standing right in the midst of it, the sound effect must be loud to attain verisimilitude. Since the volume of the rain is high and the characters are standing a short distance apart, they too must become loud in order to be heard. Because the conversation is a heated argument, loudness naturally leads to rapidity. And because Ozu does not need to employ intertitles to relate this dialogue, cuts can come faster, with speech and facial expression overlapped rather than separated. The snowballing effect of all these considerations is a scene that is narratively identical, but experientially quite different. The quiet, dark, moody sadness of the original version giving way to a more immediate, urgent sense of fury. In this way, sound is not a casual stylistic bystander for Ozu, dutifully acting in subservience to the image, but an active, leading participant, driving the aesthetic, tonal, and rhythmic character of the entire scene. Ozu's mise-en-bande is at its most sophisticated when in active conversation with his highly developed sense of mise-en-scène. Here, there are three key elements of sound to which we must attend. I shall call them sound atmospherics, sound distance, and sound bridges. They each have individual applications but are also used in tandem, creating a mise-en-bande as complex and active in its own way as Ozu's finely wrought visual stylings. First, sound atmospherics. An ambient track of naturally occurring sound that plays underneath a sequence, usually at a soft but steady volume, always implying greater space beyond that in the frame. We have already seen this with the rain in Komajuro and Sumiko's confrontation, and the crickets outside the train in the closing scene, and these are common elements Ozu might use for atmospherics. So too is diegetic music, played or performed in an adjoining room or outside down the street. Floating Weeds as an additional atmospheric I find of particular interest, a quiet but rapidly repeating clacking sound, which to my ear are hyoshigi wooden clappers being struck in quick repetition, but is almost certainly standing in for a bug or a bird. I'm left to guess on this last one because one of the most intriguing things about Ozu's atmospherics is that, unless they are readily visible amidst the core action of a scene, like rain or snow, Ozu resolutely refrains from showing us the source of the sound. His atmospherics are simple enough to stop us from demanding a visual confirmation of their creation, but evocative enough to engage some small part of our imagination, and in so doing expand the boundaries of the mise-en-scène beyond the visible. In this way, Ozu's rigorous development of physical space extends onto the soundtrack, where space may be sensed in additional directions beyond what is captured in the frame. This is a basic technique enough on its own, but becomes more significant when employed in combination with our next two terms. The second, sound distance, is a function of volume, and one of Ozu's favorite subtle tricks to employ in the creation of extravisual space. Once an atmospheric is established, Ozu may adjust its volume up or down as he cuts to different nearby spaces. most commonly up or down a level in a home or building, but also between spaces within the same town, so that the soundtrack does the work of mapping a scene's geography. If the sound is loud, we are close to its source. If it is quiet, we are more distant. In Floating Weeds, this comes into play in sequences of the troupe's stage performances, where space within the building is gauged by the volume of the ongoing performance, maintaining continuity and geographic space. Ozu's camera rarely moves, but his edits are famously unbound from typical spatial restrictions, a freedom for which this judicious use of sound volume is at least partially to thank. Atmospherics and distance further combine for our third technique, that of the sound bridge. In its typical cinematic usage, this term would apply to sounds which smooth over a major transition, most commonly by way of musical score. Ozu does this somewhat regularly with his score, usually to indicate the passage of time, but that is not the kind of bridge to which I refer. Instead, as part of Ozu's affinity for the aural sculpture of extravisual space, these sound bridges are moments when Ozu explicitly connects disparate spaces at the same moment in time through a continuous diegetic sound heard by characters in each of these spaces. For example, there is a scene which begins on the beach a ways out from town, cuts to the theater in the heart of town, and takes us back out to the docks, all in under 90 seconds, with a two-tiered sound bridge ensuring smooth spatial relations. First, on the beach, we see three men from the troupe musing about the unfolding drama as a plane flies overhead. We do not see it, but as it raises in volume, it is clearly coming near, and the men point towards it. The airplane sound continues, a bit more distant, as we cut to Sumiko on the second floor of the theater, sitting alone, distraught and fanning herself, while the rest of the troupe naps. As the plane leaves, the sounds of cicadas chirping fade into the soundtrack. With a cut to the docks on the edge of town, where Kyoshi and Kaio are sitting together contemplating the future of their illicit relationship, the cicadas increase dramatically in volume. In this way, Ozu uses two unseen atmospherics, the plane and the cicadas, and a sense of distance created by the careful manipulation of volume to craft a bridge between these three disparate spaces, making it clear that these three pieces of melodrama are unfolding simultaneously, and their emotions of fear, failure, and loss are inextricably intertwined. This sense of individuals suffering alone together, so to speak, is a favorite construction of Ozu's post-war work. What then can be learned from this experiment? I see two key conclusions, one about the career and style of Yasujiro Ozu in specific, the second a lesson about the use of sound in general, and how we should substantively consider it in classical narrative cinema. First, on the director himself. Ozu is not one to use sound as actively or multidimensionally as some of his contemporaries, particularly the sonically ambitious Kenji Mizoguchi. But the use of sound in his films is nevertheless a significant factor in how he patterns and styles his formalist aesthetic, and it is absolutely key in crafting the slower, stiller, substantially pared-down style of his post-war work that has been the focus of such admiration and attention. Ozu's mise-en-scène will always be a topic of academic and cinephilic conversation, and his mise-en-monde should have a seat at that same table for the thoughtful, sophisticated ways Ozu employs sound to create extra-visual space, expanding the concrete world of his exacting compositions into the mind of the viewer. Second, applying these lessons more generally, the case of Floating Weeds seems a strong reminder that sound design need not be complex to have a significant effect on visual art. Indeed, that sound, even when so seemingly simple and pared down, can have such a broad, far-reaching effect on the aesthetic, tells us that sound can never be dismissed, for its presence has a material, tangible impact on the art of cinematic storytelling. Even if one is telling the exact same story twice, as Ozu does here, a work with synchronous sound will produce a vastly different piece of art than one produced without it. This work will not necessarily be superior or inferior, but one from which different themes will be highlighted, different characterizations forged, different conclusions left to resonate in the mind and heart of the viewer. In contemporary screenings of the silent A Story of Floating Weeds, the Benshi narrator would conclude the film by saying, over the final image of the train pulling away, "All that was tangled now slowly unravels and falls into place. Theirs is a life of floating weeds that flow gently from place to place." So it goes for the study of sound, ersatz and unwieldy, its presence ever at hand, its meaning perpetually elusive, may its flag, like that of Kihachi's itinerant troupe, one day fly grandly in the wind.